you think of anything, just let me know. All right, so the one big last tool that we haven't talked about yet is something called the Production Possibilities Frontier. It's exactly what it sounds like. It is a curve that represents all of the production possibilities that an individual might have, that a firm might have, that an economy might have, using all of its resources. It is a graphic representation, graphical representation, so it's on a graph of all the goods and services that an individual country, region, etc., can produce using the current pool of resources that they have. Everyone's got a pool of resources. If we were doing a PPF for ourselves as individuals, our resource, our primary resource, some of you might have other resources, but our primary resource is going to be labor. So our production possibilities frontier with our labor would be what you and I could produce if we were using our labor perfectly efficient, not wasting a single second, a single minute of a single day. Now, we have a limitation to that resource of labor in that you and I only have 24 hours in a day. So we actually can't work more than that. You can't do 25 hours worth of work because that's not the resource that you have. And chances are you need to sleep and do some other things, right? But a PPF is important because it just represents to an economy or an individual what their maximum production capabilities are. It's an important thing for an individual or a country to know about themselves. It isn't something that you're actually going to see government officials putting together. It's more of a data set on that end. It's not, they probably wouldn't bother to graph it. We graph it because we know that students learn more with some of that visual representation. And so we've graphed it for you. So I'm going to bring it up for you. Sorry, I'm going to close out my mailbox real quick. So I'm going to actually bring that up for you, but first we're going to talk about some other things before we get into that, like the assumptions that we have to make before we do that graph. But the thing that the PPF does when you graph it is it creates this nice boundary between absolutely unattainable or impossible combinations of goods that you could produce. Just like I said, my limitation is 24 hours a day. So I actually wouldn't have a PPF that included 12 hours of market labor teaching and 13 hours of household production, like washing my clothes and cooking and things like that, because it's not actually possible for me to do that. So that wouldn't be included on my PPF. So the nice thing PPF does is it creates this boundary line between what's impossible to achieve given your current pool of resources and what is inefficient combinations of goods that could be produced with your resources. Most of us are inefficient. You and I promise, are not productive every minute of every day. And most companies, okay, I'm going to go out on a limb and say all companies are not efficient either with their resources. We do have a lot of waste. So before I can show you the picture, we have to make some assumptions. The PPF, those production possibilities, they change almost constantly. And so for a particular economy, just kind of why we put PPFs together typically is for entire economies. I've never done a PPF for myself, and I'm not sure that companies do it either, as much as companies try and eliminate. They don't always try and eliminate waste, but I think if it will benefit them from a financial perspective, they will. It's really economies that we would analyze PPFs from. It is a moving target. PPFs are always changing. Why? Because our resource pools typically are changing. We don't have like some given number of resources that never changes. Sometimes we deplete resource supplies, and sometimes we discover resource supplies. That's going to be one of the big reasons why that PPF is going to continue to shift. There's actually a handful of reasons, but that's one of the big ones that is pretty obvious, I think, when we talk about needing to take a snapshot in time of the PPF so that we can analyze it. A lot of information in economics, the second we write it down or we graph it, it changes. But you can't do an analysis on information that continues to change. You got to just take that little snapshot. And in this case, we have to make some assumptions when we take that snapshot. And they're pretty unrealistic, some of them. Well, the first thing we have to do just to set up a graph is we have to pick what's going to be on our X and Y axes when we set up that graph. So basically, what are the two goods, or in this case, categories of goods, that we could produce using that current pool of resources that we have? So in this case, we are going to graph an economy. And we've chosen our two outputs because we can only choose two because we only have two axes of consumer goods and capital goods. Those are the two basic categories of goods and services that would be produced in any economy. What's a consumer good? What's an example? What kind of goods are these? Thoughts? Oh, clothes. Thanks, Maggie. So clothes. So this is something that the end user consumer is going to buy for themselves and use. All that stuff sitting at Walmart, all that stuff sitting at Target, all that stuff sitting at the grocery store, most of the stuff sitting at the grocery store is going to be a consumer good for the end user consumer. Capital goods, we know what capital is. Capital goods are those things we use to produce other goods. So we actually need capital goods to produce consumer goods. We need capital goods to produce more capital goods. And so an economy typically produces both consumer goods and capital goods. The other thing we always have to do when we graph information or even collect information is we have to choose a period of time. And in a lot of cases, when we're talking about economies as a whole, we do choose a one-year period of time. And so in this case, that's the assumption that we make. We're tracking information for a one-year period of time. Here are those sort of unrealistic assumptions that we have to make. And the first one is that we have a fixed quantity and quality of resources, that we start the year with the same number and quality of resources that we end with. And that's pretty unrealistic. We always have changes in resource supply. Fixed technology. Technology is what makes labor more productive. Technology is one of the greatest resources that we have to increase production. And especially here in this country, we're always looking for new technology. And we actually, a lot of times, are on the forefront of that technology to increase production. Why? Because in this country, labor is expensive. And if you're going to employ labor, you need it to be really, really productive. And how do you make labor productive? You give it technology. So for this example, we have to freeze technology. We have to fix it. There's no change in technology from January 1st to December 31st, according to our assumptions. We just have to do it. And the last one is that we have fixed rules of the game. For those of you who either had me last semester and you remember, if there's any readers in our group, what would, or if you just want to take a guess, what would be the rules of the game?
Could it be things like price caps caused by the market?
It probably would be price caps caused by the market, but maybe price caps put in place by the government. That would be a good one. Regulation, laws, taxes. Thanks, Emma. For the most part, it's regulations and laws. So anything government imposed is going to be a rule of the game. You have to abide by it if you're going to produce in this economy. The other thing that we throw in here too is customs of the culture. It is something we have to take into consideration because people in this country are vocal. And if you go against the customs, it could create a problem for you in terms of media press and things like that, that could end up being a problem for you. So there are frequent changes in rules of the game, especially if we've seen new politicians come into office. It's one of their favorite things to change is the rules of the game, because the rules of the game impact a lot of really big things, like the stock market, like the environment. And so each politician has a slightly different agenda based on the voters that elected them and what those people want, and make changes to rules of the game in order to make their constituents happy, right? There's always a trade-off. There are costs and benefits to everything. We know that. And so when you give the environment some consideration, something else has to pay the price. If you're giving profits the consideration, the environment's going to pay the price. So there's lots of different agendas, lots of different rules of the game. But in this particular instance, when we are evaluating a PPF over a 1-year period of time, we have to assume this is going to be fixed. Or we just can't plot the information and we can't analyze it, right? So let's look at a PPF. So this is your first look at the PPF. The PPF is actually that red line, sorry, not a line, a curve, is that red curve that starts at point A and then slopes down and we end up at point F. Every point along the PPF, not just points A, B, C, D, E, and F, but every point between A and B, between B and C, every point along that red line, because that curve isn't actually a curve. It's actually a bunch of points that are so close together, right? The points form the curve. So we don't plot the curve. We plot the points, and the points create the curve, if that makes sense. So every single solitary point, including A and F, by the way, this is a common mistake that students make, is they don't think A and F are included on the PPF, but those extremes are included, or any single point on the graph in between, okay? You can, if we look at point A, you can produce 0 capital goods and all consumer goods. You could do that. That would be perfectly efficient. Most economies don't do that because you do need capital goods, but it is theoretically efficient on the PPF, perfectly efficient use of resources, okay? Anything up there in the pink is going to be impossible or totally unattainable. You might one day be able to produce in that pink area if you have increases in technology, increases in resources, some other things we're going to talk about here in a minute. But right now, today, anything above your PPF is impossible or totally unattainable, okay? Anything below in that light blue is an inefficient use of resources. Here in the US, are we inefficient with our resources? Do you think we produce below our PPF, or do you think we produce on our PPF? Below, absolutely below. What is the resource that we are underutilizing right now in this economy more than any other? What resource are we underutilizing to the point that we are being pushed deeper and deeper and deeper into that, towards the origin, into our inefficient area? We have a very wasted resource right now. Thank you, Devin. It is labor, right? Unemployment is actually our indicator of waste of resources. One of our most expensive, precious, limited resources. So as unemployment gets higher and higher, in my mind, right, looking at things from an economic perspective, we are pushing ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper into this inefficient area below our ppf. Typically, we still produce below our ppf. There is no way that here in the United States or in any other economy, as the case may be, that we are producing perfectly efficient. I don't think there's any, and I say this, and I might be wrong, but none of the big economies are producing along their ppf. It's impossible to be perfectly efficient and not have any waste. Now, is there probably a community, a small community or tribe somewhere who is really monitoring full usage of all their resources? Yeah, absolutely, because they probably need that for survival. But in most economies, that's not going to be the case. We are going to produce at least at some range inside of our ppf, okay? All right, so I'm going to toggle back and forth between this slide and a couple of the next slides, just so you can continue to see the visual of the ppf. But let's talk a little bit about the shape of that ppf, that curve, right? And the first thing we're gonna talk about is what happens when we move from point A to point B to point C along that curve, starting at the top, where we were producing all consumer goods, and working our way down the curve to produce more and more capital goods. This is actually the definition of efficiency, is that if we are producing at point A, which is all consumer goods and no capital goods, it's perfectly efficient. So if we do want to produce more capital goods, because we're already being perfectly efficient with our resources at point A, when we go to point B, or any point lower than A, we are giving up some consumer good in order to gain capital good, because you're already using all of your resources, which means you have to give up some of the resources you're using to make consumer goods in order to make the capital goods. So that's the thing about efficiency. It's like the 24 hours in your day. If you want to study more, you got to do something else less. If you want to work more, you got to do something else less, because you have the confines of this resource that is your 24 hours in a day, right? It's the same for a economy's pool of resources. You have to give up something in order to gain if you're already being perfectly efficient, okay? All right, and that brings us to the law of increasing opportunity cost. The law of increasing opportunity cost is actually the phenomenon, and we're going to go back and actually look at the numbers, is the phenomenon that we will watch, that we will see, that we will calculate as we move from point A all the way down to point F. So the law of increasing opportunity cost says, in this case, right, with this example, to produce more capital goods, that's what's along our x-axis, a successively larger amount of consumer goods must be sacrificed. So as we work our way down from A to F, what we're going to see is that what we have to give up, that's the opportunity cost, right? It's the next best thing foregone. Well, if you want to produce more capital goods, what you're foregoing is consumer goods and vice versa. That you have to give up more and more and more as you move from point A to point B, B to C, C to D, so on and so forth, okay? So let's go back to the PPF and let's do that. Let's start at point A. So you start at point A and you work down to point B, right? You gain 10 million units of capital good. And if you'll notice, all the increments that have been marked for you at those points are a 10 million unit increase in capital good. That's going to stay consistent for us. But as we gain each additional 10 million units, let's look at what happens to consumer goods, and let's calculate how much consumer good we had to give up in order to get that next 10 million units of capital good. So as we go from point A to point B, or 0 capital good to 10 million, how much consumer good did we have to give up? What's the opportunity cost in terms of consumer goods?
2 million.
Thank you, 2 million, okay, because we went from 50 to 48. So we only had to give up 2 million units to gain 10 as we move from consumer to more capital. How about when we gain the next 10 million units from 10 to 20, how much do we give up? 5, thank you, okay? So the opportunity cost just increased from 2 to 5. And then as we go from C to D, what happens? Too early for math? It's gonna be 9, right? It is too early for math, I'll agree. Then it goes to 9, and then it goes to 14. And then to gain those last 10 million units from E to F, or from 40 to 50, you have to give up 20 million units in order to gain that 10. That's the increasing opportunity cost. So we start at A and we go to F. In order to gain the same number of additional units of capital good, we have to give up more and more and more of our consumer goods. Okay, so just hang on to that. Don't overthink it. But now let's talk about why, because this is actually the takeaway. The takeaway isn't really understanding the law of increasing opportunity costs thoroughly. This is actually the takeaway. That this happens, what this all means is that there are economies with resource supplies that are better suited to make one type of good over another. So some economies' pool of resources might actually be better suited to making consumer goods and not to making capital goods. So as we begin to convert our production from one to the other, what we find is that the resource pool that we have actually is better suited to making one or the other. So as we force ourselves from one extreme to the next on this Ppf, it actually becomes more and more difficult for most economies to go from one extreme to the other, because our resource supplies actually naturally are better suited towards one or the other. So economies typically don't operate at A or F, because our combination of resources kind of helps drive us to that perfect point, as close to our Ppf as we can possibly get. What resources do you think an economy might have that would be better suited towards the production of consumer goods? Think about the things you buy at Walmart. I can wait. Nothing? Thank you. I will repeat the question. Physical labor, you might be right, Floor. You probably need physical labor for both of them, but you're probably right. I thank you, Ethan. That's probably the answer that I would have suggested, was agriculture. But I was asking, what resources might an economy have that would be better suited towards producing consumer goods? Agriculture is a great example. Cotton to make clothing. We don't make a lot of capital goods with cotton, right? We're talking about usually machinery or factories, buildings, things like that. Wheat, something like that. Oil, Powell, you probably need oil for both. Yeah, that's a good one. You probably need it for both though, but you definitely need a lot of it for consumer goods. But if we're thinking about something like food, like wheat or vegetables, any sort of edible crop, those are going to be consumer goods. Since when do we make capital goods with broccoli? Yet we just don't, right? So it just depends on your resource pool. So here's the takeaway. The reason the law of increasing opportunity costs exists is because we know that every economy has their own unique pool of resource that is better suited to making one over the other. And so if we had lots of agriculture, we actually do have lots of agriculture, and we are trying to force our economy into making all capital goods, we get down to point E and we're trying to convert our resources into capital goods. How much wheat does it take to build a factory? It's just, so things get crazy as we try and force ourselves into making goods that we really don't have the resources suitable to make those goods with. If that makes sense. That's the takeaway. We all have unique pools of resources, okay? Don't overthink that one at all. All right, let's talk about shifts in the PPF, the production possibilities frontier. This thing shifts. It moves in its entirety sometimes, one direction or the other. Typically here in the United States, we see our PPF move in the upward, outward direction to the right. So we see it increase, sort of move into that unattainable area. We call this economic growth, right? If your PPF increases, you're having economic growth. We typically see this happen at a rate of about 3% a year here in the US. That would be a good, sustainable, healthy rate of growth. And economic growth, by definition, is the increase in the economy's ability to produce goods and services. So it would manifest itself as an outward shift of the economy's PPF. Might we see a decrease in the PPF? Absolutely. For a couple of different reasons we might see that. We typically don't see it here in the US, but other companies, yeah, but mostly countries do see a decrease in their PPF for a variety of reasons, and we're going to talk about those reasons. So here are the 4 reasons we typically see the PPF shift in either direction. The first is a change in resource availability. Have you run out of resources? You might see a decrease in your PPF. Have you discovered new resource availability? Typically, that's what we see happen, and that would increase a PPF. So technically, it could go in either direction because of a change in resource availability. The second one, increase or decrease in capital stock. Capital stock can be confusing for those of you in finance. We're not talking about stock market stock. We're talking about stock in terms of your inventory. So your inventory of capital. So you can see increases or decreases in capital. Hopefully, your economy's paying attention and the companies in your economy are paying attention and are growth oriented and are increasing the amount of capital that they are creating and preserving, etc. When might you see a decrease in capital stock? When might we see huge decreases in the amount of capital in an economy? Any thoughts? It's usually war. Usually war creates decreases, huge decreases in capital. If buildings and factories and machinery and equipment and whatever, natural disasters, thanks, that's another one, right? Can destroy capital. Actually, it's a great one, Russell, natural disasters. But other than those big things, we would typically see an economy try and increase their capital inventory or their capital stock. The third thing is technological changes. This is a huge driver here in the US. We are constantly trying to come up with new and better technology to increase production. Why? Because people are expensive. If you're going to employ an American at the hourly rate that we require, you got to make them really productive during that hour. How do you make a human more productive? You give them technology. You can increase their productivity exponentially with technology. And if technology typically only shifts the PPF upward and outward. If you implement technology and it decreases your PPF, please stop using the technology, right? Typically, it only makes things better, not worse. Sometimes it can make things worse for a little while, but after the learning curve, push it back up. But technology usually works in just one direction. And then a change in the rule of the game. So if we have someone come into office that is interested in regulating the environment, sometimes that will slow economic growth, but preserve the environment, right? There's always a cost and benefit. But if we have someone come into office that is focused on productivity and the environment is not as important to that agenda, typically we will see lots of economic growth. So just depends. Economic incentives to create new technology, things like that, would also be a driver. Okay, under rules of the game. All right, so let's look at some examples of shifts here. This is simply just the visual representation of what we just talked about, okay? So here you see the Ppf shifting upward and outward, which is what we typically do see here in the US, and the different reasons above it why we might see that happen. Decrease, second graph, again, it's just the visual of what you and I already talked about. But here's the interesting thing. This is just really a segue to the next slide. And the next slide is that it is much more realistic when a PPF shifts that it will do it more in favor of one good than another. And that makes sense because the chances that we're going to see a change in a resource supply that's going to equally impact both types of goods, the production of both types of goods, isn't really good. If it's oil, yeah, maybe. It's going to impact production of everything, right? But if it's we have a great growing season and a bumper crop of something, well, that's going to look more like this first graph, where we see a big bump in the consumer goods and you can see capital goods remains basically unchanged, right? And vice versa. Any questions about PPFs before we move on? Okie doke. Okay, so now we're going to move on. We're done with economic tools. Now we're going to move on to economic systems. I think much more interesting part of the chapter because it is something really that I think you and I probably think about on a regular basis. The mechanisms that make economic systems work. And for those of you who travel, I am always fascinated when I go to a different place to see how these mechanisms work in terms of their economic system. So economic systems by definition are the set of mechanisms and institutions that resolve the what gets produced, how it gets produced, and for whom it gets produced, questions with regards to goods and services. This varies greatly from system to system. But the way that we look at this is on a spectrum. If we put pure capitalism on one end of the spectrum and pure command, which is we also refer to as communism, on the other end of the spectrum, every economy lies somewhere in between. There's actually not an economy out there that lies solely on one extreme end or another of this spectrum. Instead, we're all mixed economies. That doesn't mean that everybody lies in the middle, right? There are definitely economies that lie more towards capitalist or more towards command, but all economies in existence are actually some mix of the two, okay? All right, so let's talk about pure capitalism first. This is in its purest form. In its purest form, capitalism would be a system in which market forces, which are natural market forces, which happen in an economy just because of the natural human behavior and decision making, would allocate resources as if by invisible hand. Invisible hand is something we talk about a lot in economics to explain the stuff we can't really explain. It just happens. It happens because of human behavior. It just does. Nobody makes it happen. It just happens, right? Because of the pursuit of self-interest. You and I do things that are in our own best interest, and as a result, markets sort things out as if by invisible hand. It directs this type of system, of economic system, would direct resources towards where they earn the greatest reward. You and I have an incentive to produce the greatest amount of benefit. Companies have the interest to produce the greatest amount of profits, and somewhere in between, right? We work it all out, but that would be pure capitalism if everything was done that way, with that interest in mind, greatest reward. One of the biggest differences between these two extreme economic systems is private property rights. Under capitalism, individuals have the right to own property and use it as they wish. And under pure capitalism, they could use it for whatever they wanted. There would be no constraint on what you could use your private property for. And I'm just not talking about land. Your labor is your private property under pure capitalism. And you can literally do anything you want with your time, and do anything you want with whatever other property you own under this type of pure system. Now, if you were in a purely capitalist society and there were people who didn't have any resources, what would happen to them? Thoughts? They would die, okay? Under this type of system, there is no room for the disabled, the elderly, or children who have been abandoned with no one to care for them, right? That's what this system would imply, is that there was no room for people without a resource to sell. So pure capitalism, not an ideal, not really something to strive towards, and doesn't exist anyway. And there's a reason it doesn't exist. It's because it's not an ideal system, right? Where people with no resources are literally left to their own devices. All right, now let's talk about pure command. Are the slides on BB Learn is the question. Yes, Colby, no, they are not on BB Learn, they're on Cengage. If you look over to the right-hand side, there is a Google, there's a Google Drive icon. They're all in there. Pure command or communism, we have to be careful when we talk about communism in an economics class, that we are really clear that we are not talking about the atrocities that communism has allowed to happen in history or really in current day. When we talk about communism in the context of economics, it's an economic system that at its core could be a good thing. Now, the problem is it's not applied typically the way that it's portrayed as to benefit everyone. It's usually applied in a way that benefits very few. But at its core, this system actually pools property, provides a public, all of us own it together, or communal ownership of property. And then we would ideally select people we thought would work in our best interest, government planners who would centralize plans, do all the planning very centralized together in one place, direct resources to where they would benefit the people the most, the population, and coordinate that production. it actually is a very efficient system if it's applied correctly. The problem is it's typically not applied correctly. Doesn't create the right incentives for the right people to do the right thing. And so a lot of times it ends up very skewed and actually very different than what the economic system would imply at its core. And so it really doesn't work out very well. Okay? So let's talk about, I think we know which countries are mostly capitalist countries. What countries do you think fall on that communism half of the spectrum? Any thoughts? China, Cuba, good ones. Definitely fall on that 50%. Korea, North Korea specifically, yep. Vietnam, I'm really not sure about Vietnam. I think it gets a little more capitalist all the time. I'm not sure, but I don't know that it's a wrong answer. But great, these all look good. The most communist country from an economic perspective is probably Cuba. We think Cuba is about at the 90% communist or command economic when we actually look at the way it's been applied, okay? China, it's hard to tell. We know it falls on that end of the spectrum. Honestly, I can't tell you exactly where it would lie. Where do you think the US lies on that spectrum? What percentage of the US economy do you think is command or communist or has those ideals? How much of our economy do you think the government dictates? Is the question. I have a 45%. Any other guesses? 25? A third? Yep. Right. Oh, wow. Those are some high numbers. Yeah, it's actually a third. It's about 35%. So 35% of our economy is dictated by the government or government regulations, or the government owns industries or specializes in the production of certain things. This is not a bad thing, right? No offense, but I don't want you coordinating national security, right? We want to put somebody in charge of that. I want someone in charge of building and maintaining airports other than random people, right? Or roads or any of that, right? I want there to be an entity that specializes in that and make sure it gets done. Hopefully, so we are 30% communist. Well, we lie 30% towards that end of the spectrum. I hope that answers your question. All right, good. Oh, and the interesting thing about North Korea, mildly interesting thing about North Korea, is that we actually think, and we gather information from people who have gotten out of North Korea to try and figure out how communist it really is from an econ perspective. And it appears about half of the individuals in North Korea earn their living solely through capitalist activity. Choosing what to do with their time, their resource, making money, hustling, if you will, doing what they have to do to maximize the benefit of the resources that they have. Sometimes that doesn't mean an official business, right? But the government of North Korea knows how half the people in that country are earning their money. That can't be a secret, right? So while North Korea, we would all consider it communist, and it does surely fall on that end of the spectrum, maybe it's not as far over as we think it is, because we're looking at what's actually happening, not what the government says is happening, what's actually happening with the economic system, okay? All right, last slide. United States is a mixed economy. All economies are mixed economies, by the way. What are some examples of our capitalist traits? Give me a few and we can move on and you guys can go. Give me a few. Capitalist traits. How do you know we fall 2/3 to that side? Big corporations, good. Private property, it's the big one, right? Yeah. You get to choose your career, all kinds of stuff, right? How do we know we're a third command? How do we know we fall a third of the way towards the communist end of that spectrum? What are some of our traits? Laws and regulations. It's a great one. Give me a couple more. We can call it done. Price competition. The government runs national security. Perfect. Price competition, Taylor. It's probably mostly capitalist, health codes, antitrust, all good stuff. Okay. Any law, regulation, minimum wage. It's a perfect one. Okay. All right, folks. That's all I have.